Apart, Episode 19, Intermission. The last few weeks have been pretty military history heavy, and that's exactly what I said I would not try to be back in episode 14. I'm sorry for that. I'm trying to make up for it in this episode, though. We'll talk a bit about the final movement of UN forces to the 38th parallel, but there's about a week delay between reaching the 38th and crossing the 38th, and I want to use that as an excuse to take a bit of a tour around the decision centers that matter to our story. So we'll spend some time in Seoul and Pyongyang, and we'll also go to Tokyo, Beijing, Washington, Moscow, and New York to better understand the changing politics of the war. On September 29th at about 10 a.m., Douglas MacArthur and Syngman Rhee landed at Kimpo Airfield. Of course, given the stature of these men, they flew in separately, with Rhee arriving shortly after MacArthur. Now, I don't specifically know if MacArthur's earlier arrival was a matter of him wanting to inspect troops before Rhee's arrival, if Rhee wanted to be fashionably late as a power move over MacArthur, or if I'm just overanalyzing a schedule, but I wouldn't be surprised if MacArthur wanted to arrive early to give the world the feeling that he was receiving Rhee in Rhee's own capital, subconsciously showing who MacArthur thought was really in charge of Korea. In celebration of their great victory, MacArthur and Rhee held a ceremony on the day of their return. With pieces of glass still falling off the ceiling of the National Assembly building from the nearby cannon blasts, both men gave rousing speeches commemorating the fallen, thanking their soldiers for their fighting ability, and just generally patting themselves on the back. This ceremony was a minor event in the grand scheme of things, but I think it just reinforces the symbolic value of Seoul. Seoul, of course, had a great deal of real value to the war effort, considering it's the largest city in Korea, and it is that narrow part of the hourglass that is the transportation and communications networks on the peninsula. But as we discussed, MacArthur understood the value of symbolism during a war, and I suspect this ceremony was an instance of him getting as much value as possible out of the victories at Inchon and on the Pusan Perimeter. As hard as I am on Douglas MacArthur, like I even have any right to do that, MacArthur was kind of correct to wring all political value out of the moment as he could, in hindsight at least, because things would soon enough be much more difficult for the old general. Just a few hours after landing in Seoul, MacArthur returned to the comforts of Tokyo to plan his next masterstroke. Just to set the stage for this episode, let's get UN forces back up to the 38th parallel. Last we left them, UN forces had recaptured a good chunk of South Korea, but certainly not all of it. However, because of the sheer totality of the Korea People's Army's collapse after September 15th in the northwest and after September 21st in the southeast, it took just 4 days from first contact between I and X Corps on the 27th for UN forces to cut off the 38th parallel. I Corps' divisions stretched from Daegu northwestward towards Suwon, X Corps' forces concentrated around Seoul and Inchon, 9th Corps' forces reoccupied the southwestern portion of the peninsula. The Republic of Korea Army drove north from their portion of the front line. The rapid advance of the ROKA was especially remarkable, given they were not nearly as well motorized as their American and British counterparts. Some ROKA units were even able to make 10 miles a day, which is impressive considering the difficult weather and terrain, and that these were men who had been fighting desperately for weeks already. It's a bit hard to fully separate out whether the collapse of the KPA or the skill of the UN forces had more of an impact on that 2-week period at the end of September. It's kind of like a chicken and egg argument. Was the UN's rapid advance caused by the KPA's collapse, or was the KPA's collapse caused by the UN's rapid advance? Ultimately, I don't think it really matters because it's clear that the KPA was working on borrowed time after the failure of the September offensive, and the landings at Inchon just pushed them over the precipice. So the easiest, most logical answer is that both caused each other, for the KPA's collapse was imminent enough that any increased stress anywhere on the lines would have been enough to cause it. As he was heading back to Tokyo, MacArthur had a decision to make. With the Korea People's Army falling back across the 38th parallel, the question was now not, would the UN armies survive, but how far should the war go? To MacArthur, an ardent anti-communist, that answer was easy. This war should go as far as possible, past Pyongyang to Beijing and Moscow. Elsewhere, while the attitude on whether or not to cross the 38th may have been similar, the question of how far to go raised different answers. That same day of the ceremony, MacArthur received a message of congratulations from the new Secretary of Defense, George Marshall. Marshall replaced Louis Johnson, who was forced to resign by Truman just 1 week prior to Marshall's message to MacArthur. Along with that message, MacArthur received a top-secret radio message from the Secretary. Marshall directed the Supreme Commander to feel, quote, unhampered tactically and strategically to proceed north of the 38th, end quote. This set the fires alight in MacArthur's mind, with plans for another amphibious operation coalescing. A shock landing would surprise the North Koreans, and a massive push from the south would smash them against the sea. The folks back in Washington had no thoughts on this plan, mostly because they had no idea this was what MacArthur was planning. He kept the operation very close to the chest, so close that the operation never happened. The only limitations Marshall and Washington placed on MacArthur at this time were that air attacks against Sino-Soviet targets outside of Korea were off limits, and that operations north of the parallel could only commence if there was no evidence of Sino-Soviet intervention. At the time, from Tokyo, such an intervention seemed improbable. Thus, MacArthur had all the permission he needed to move north. Just because that amphibious operation didn't happen doesn't mean MacArthur didn't prepare for it. Now, the smart money would have the UN forces split in two, with one part rushing towards Pyongyang, chasing the KPA up to Manchuria, and the other pushing northeast to Wonsan, the east coast port city that MacArthur wanted to capture amphibiously. This would trap what was thought to be the bulk of KPA forces south of this new UN wall of soldiers, and it would also place much of North Korea into the hands of the South, allowing for the UN resolutions of 1948 to finally be fulfilled and elections held across most of Korea. However, MacArthur instead ordered X-Corps back onto their ships to reposition for the East Coast landing. Because of the narrow nature of Inchon Harbor, which we discussed a few weeks ago, embarking was a lengthy process for the men of X-Corps. They would not properly start moving towards Wonsan for MacArthur's second landing until the men of the 8th Army were crossing the parallel on land and well after Wonsan was already occupied by the ROKA. On July 19th, visions of reunification were already dancing in Syngman-ri's head. This, of course, was in the midst of the collapse of the Republic of Korea Army, a fine time to be thinking of what one should do once victorious. That day in July, Ri wrote Truman a letter, in which he said, quote, now that the North Korean government, which had been established by the Soviets unlawfully, invaded the South across the line by force, there is no reason that we should respect such a line as the 38th parallel, end quote. To boot, Ri added that a return to quote-unquote pre-war conditions was intolerable. He reiterated these points in multiple speeches and meetings throughout September, as victory now seemed within his grasp. Whether or not the Americans would cross the parallel, the men serving under Ri would certainly move north of the parallel in retaliation for this war of northern aggression. So strong was this urge in Ri that on September 30th he announced that the South would not allow themselves to stop and ordered the ROKA across the parallel, without the Americans. That's why today's episode name is not completely accurate, as the ROKA continued fighting from Daegu and Pohang all the way up the peninsula, past the parallel. There was only an intermission for non-Koreans. On the 30th, the 1st Division moved north from Inchon, in central Korea, and the 3rd and Capital Divisions moved up the east coast towards Wonsan. There was no rest for those men who so recently were nearly broken. Back in Washington, the general mood about the 38th parallel was best described by Secretary of State Dean Acheson when he said, quote, troops could not be expected to march up to a surveyor's line and stop. As a boundary, it had no political value, end quote. Even though the Americans had first proposed the 38th parallel as a boundary and enforced it as a national border, there was now little faith in their ability to restrain Ri and MacArthur's enthusiasm for Korean reunification. But even if there was faith at the cabinet or lower level, it would not have mattered much because, in the words of his biographer, David McCullough, Truman never agonized over the decision to cross the 38th parallel, or at least there's no record of any private vacillation on Truman's part. Publicly, though, Truman acted as though the decision was not his to make. At a press conference on the 21st, he deferred to the United Nations on the matter. Just 6 days later, though, on September 27th, Truman approved a memo stating that the main objective of the UN forces was now the destruction of the North Korean armed forces. That's a very different message from the one presented 2 months before, the message of saving a country from aggression. This new mission was meant to punish that aggression. This was a bit of a heat of the moment decision, given that there was a great deal of excitement about the potential for an American victory early in what was becoming the Cold War. That does not mean, though, that it was not well grounded in the facts of the situation. The UN forces had just won major victories, the KPA was retreating more quickly than anyone expected, and the UN coalition was growing ever larger, as various countries decided where they wanted to land on the American-Soviet divide. In New York, the members of the United Nations were faced with a new dilemma. Now that collapse was no longer imminent, should the UN forces under MacArthur's command move north of the 38th? Such a move was not explicitly outlined in the resolutions passed by the Security Council back in June and July. Those resolutions only called for member states to take actions to help repel the North's aggression from the South. It was clear to most all involved that repelling did not mean counter-invading the aggressor. Furthermore, once the Soviets realized the danger presented to themselves by their absence from the Council, their representative returned to the table, limiting the Council's usefulness to the Americans. On October 7th, at the encouragement of the American delegation, 8 nations, notably Britain and Australia, but not the United States, sponsored a draft resolution that would allow for UN military action above the 38th parallel. This resolution passed with 47 in favor, 5 against, and 7 abstentions. The only states that voted against were, of course, the Soviet Union and its allies, and the abstentions came from India, who was taking a relatively neutral place in international politics after its independence, Yugoslavia, and 5 Arab nations. This resolution gave MacArthur the go-ahead to restore international peace in Korea and establish a unified, independent, and democratic government of Korea. The specific language in the resolution that authorized a crossing of the 38th parallel is vague at best. I.F. Stone theorizes that the vagueness of the final resolution was designed to intentionally leave the crossing authorization as an implied approval and not a direct approval as one would expect. Stone gives 5 reasons for that vagueness. 1. Some states fear that the Americans acting without an action of the UN would antagonize the Soviets too much. 2. Allowing a crossing without approval from the UN would subordinate the UN to the US, as it was pretty clear what the Americans planned to do by this point. 3. A direct approval by the UN could alienate the People's Republic of China and instigate another world war. 4. The UN could not afford to antagonize the US at this point in its history. And 5. The more independent-minded member states had a reasonable fear that, if they committed the UN forces to a crossing of the parallel that instigated a reprisal by China, they would, in Stone's words, commit themselves in advance to the consequences. To Stone, the vagueness of the resolution gave the Americans what they needed to move forward, while giving other states the leeway to disown the action in the future if things went a bit sideways. Tacit approval was all MacArthur needed, though, as he now had it mostly free rein to reunify the peninsula by force. Even after Inchon, Kim's resolve stayed strong. He did not want to give up on his dreams of reunifying Korea under his banner. Even as the KPA's defenses broke around Seoul, there was still a genuine belief that the KPA could hold the enemy to the 38th parallel if they did not make a concerted effort to cross that line. On the 29th, General Terentij Shtaikov, the Soviet ambassador, met with Kim and Pak Han-yong in Pyongyang to discuss what to do next. Kim wanted to immediately organize 15 new divisions, which is a bonkers number of new divisions for a collapsing army, and hold at the 38th parallel. He hoped that the UN forces would stop at the parallel, a hope which was not grounded in the reality of the situation and, I think, shows his relative inexperience both in politics and in conventional warfare. That same day, Kim and Pak sent a letter to Stalin asking for support, pinpointing the Inchon landing as the moment where the KPA's situation switched from one of advantage to one of disadvantage. They ended that letter asking Stalin not for direct assistance from the Soviets, but for Soviet assistance in convincing the Chinese to enter the war. 2 days later, an emissary of Kim arrived in Beijing with just such a request for help, a topic we will discuss more in a future episode. Despite his resolve, Kim was seriously worried about what would happen in the next few weeks. His concern was not quickly alleviated by Shcheikov, who generally wanted to wait for direction from Moscow before advising or acting on his own. This earned him a stinging rebuke from Stalin, but Stalin's annoyance wasn't strong enough to force Shcheikov out. Stalin said that the North Koreans' self-confidence would fade quickly if Shcheikov continued to refuse timely support or advice. He gave the general 4 points to pass on to Kim and Pak. 1. Assure them that the Soviets would provide equipment for any new divisions if used in defense of the parallel. 2. Pyongyang-directed guerrillas should continue to fight behind UN lines. 3. Leadership needed to stress the individual requirements of the national defense to prevent a collapse in morale on the home front. And 4. Stalin would discuss their request for assistance with the Chinese in a few days' time. All this was very heartening to Kim. Maybe the war wouldn't be so easily lost after all, as long as their Chinese and Soviet friends had their back. Mao was understandably concerned about the prospects of any American move north of the 38th parallel. The reason for Mao's concern, alongside the concern of other top communist leaders in Beijing, was that they did not want an American ally directly on their border. That's why, by the end of September, the Americans had received a message from Zhou Enlai via the Indian government that China would enter the war if UN forces crossed the parallel. Across the national security apparatus of the time, the Joint Chiefs, the State Department, and in the Pentagon, this was thought to be a bluff. And that's not entirely wrong, as it would be a bit of time until Chinese soldiers would properly enter the war. But this marked a new stage of the Chinese plans to enter the war in support of their Korean comrades. This new stage was further supported by a message from Stalin asking for Chinese support on the peninsula. Now, volunteers would be gathered, troops would be repositioned, and a storm would arise across the Yalu River as specifically American soldiers moved across the parallel. Turns out that message from the Indian government was not a bluff after all. Chinese intervention would be initiated if non-Korean soldiers crossed the parallel and approached the Yalu River that forms the border between China and Korea. In a few weeks' time, I think, we'll spend much more time on that as we discuss the moves and motives behind the Chinese intervention into the war. After the landings at Inchon, Stalin's advice to Kim was to form a defensive perimeter on the north and east sides of Seoul to corral the UN forces in the northwest corner of South Korea. This would allow the KPA forces down by the Naktung River the opportunity for an orderly retreat north that, of course, did not happen. To assess the situation for themselves, Stalin sent a military mission to Pyongyang, headed by General Matvey Vasilyevich Zakharov, who had command experience in Ukraine and Manchuria. Zakharov's report was dismal at best. He recognized that the U.S. Air Force had air superiority over much of Korea, that any KPA units south of the 38th parallel, which was mostly all of them, were in dire straits, and that the KPA command structure was badly organized after 2 months of rough fighting. To fix the first problem, Stalin ordered a fighter aviation regiment to Pyongyang on the 20th. To fix the second problem, retreat and regrouping was the only option. To fix the third problem, Kim was made Supreme Commander-in-Chief and Defense Minister, giving him total control of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea's military and national security apparatus, precipitating further reorganization down the line. Stalin, before the Zakharov report even crossed his desk, sent a very strongly worded message to Pyongyang, placing the blame for the KPA's collapse at the feet of the Soviet military advisors in the capital. He recognized the failures of the command structure as well, and in the words of historian Wada Haruki, he was enormously sympathetic to Kim and other North Korean leaders. The Soviets would now make every effort short of joining the war with their own soldiers to support the North Koreans against this existential threat. With October coming to a close and those forces now released from the perimeter racing northward, General Walker declared that the soldiers of the 8th Army would take a bit of a break at the 38th. And this was not for rest and relaxation, this was to give the logistics companies time to catch back up to the fighting vanguards. So quick had the UN advance been that, for a few days, their supply lines were overstretched in their own country, as supplies for I and Ninth Corps were still brought in through Pusan. Supplies through Inchon, which was, frankly, the lion's share of tonnage at this point in time, were directed solely to X Corps. When the bulk of the 8th Army's forces reached the parallel on the final day of September, the war moved into a brief intermission for the non-Korean soldiers on the peninsula. The first act ended, and the curtains were about to rise on the second act. In preparation for that second act, MacArthur's voice boomed across the North Korean airwaves, demanding that the KPA lay down their arms now to avoid a total defeat. With no response from his adversary, MacArthur saw the doors open across that monumentally important invisible line. On October 9th, the U.S. Army crossed the 38th parallel. And that's where we'll leave our discussion for now, with the imperialist armies marching on the Great Fatherland. It was actually the soldiers of freedom fighting to liberate an illegally ruled people. But either way, this was another twist in the story that is the Korean War. Next week, we will discuss what that march entailed. If you're on social media, you can find us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook as @CTCA Podcast. If you are not on social media, or if you just want to look around, you can find more information, including the references for today's episode, at ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. That's ctcapodcast.libsyn.com. We release new episodes every Tuesday. Please be sure to subscribe and leave a rating wherever you listen to podcasts. I am Trevor Owens, and this is Coming Together, Coming Apart. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an enjoyable week.